Hello, good morning. Je m'appelle Paul Kennedy. Je suis l'animateur d'une émission qui s'appelle Ideas on CBC Radio. My name is Paul Kennedy. I'm the host of a program called Ideas on CBC Radio. And it has been my unmitigated pleasure to be the host of these ceremonies from the get-go, way back in Montreal a few years back. And I will get things going quickly, if I can, by introducing Sylvain Charbonneau, who will be here from the University of Ottawa to give us some welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Paul. I don't think this microphone is working. Is it? Is the microphone on? It's not? All right, I'll speak loud. So, bonjour, chers invités. Mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, au nom de la communauté de la recherche de l'Université d'Ottawa, je vous souhaite la bienvenue au pavillon Roger Guindon, qui héberge la faculté de médecine et certains secteurs de la faculté des sciences de la santé, mais de façon plus importante, un groupe exceptionnel et distingué de chercheurs en santé. I would like to start by paying respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardian of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with the territories, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in the region from all nations across Canada, who call Ottawa home. Nous reconnaissons les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels, jeunes et âgés. Nous honorons aussi leurs courageux dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain. Comme vous le savez sans doute, les instituts de recherche en santé du Canada jouent un rôle primordial pour faire avancer la recherche en santé depuis leur création en 2000, lorsque Alan Rock, ancien recteur de l'Université d'Ottawa, et ministre de la Santé à ce moment, Alan Rock est mon animaire, qui est présent ici aujourd'hui. Merci, Mona, d'être venu. Who preceded me as Vice President Research here at the University of Ottawa, have long been associated with the Canadian Institute for Health Research. They supported Henry Friesen novel vision for a federal funding agency of health research. The University of Ottawa's partnership with Friends of CIHR goes back many years, and it's an honor for the university to continue this long-standing collaboration. I would like to thank Obi Angel, thank you, Obi, its president, for the time he has devoted year after year to ensure the success of the Henry Friesen International Prize in Health Research. I would also like to warmly welcome Dr. Friesen himself, after whom this award is named. We are honored that you are with us today. Thank you for your unfailing attendance to this event year after year. The university is proud to host Henry Friesen's award recipient and to give our student access to such eminent scientists. Events such as this one often inspire or feed passion for discovery among our young researchers. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate Dr. David Naylor on winning this year's Henry Friesen inaugural International Prize in Health Research. He is one of Canada's most respected experts on healthcare policy and is best known for his exhaustive review on how fundamental science is funded in Canada. We are especially pleased to be hosting Dr. Naylor today, since health research has long been a key strategic area of development of research for the University of Ottawa. Our investment in fundamental and interdisciplinary research and our invaluable partnership with our affiliated Hospital Research Institute have led to medical breakthroughs in treating diseases such as cancer, multiple sclerosis, and better understanding the brain disorder. De telles percées scientifiques sont facilitées, entre autres, par des collaborations interdisciplinaires. Nos recherches en santé chevauchent les disciplines telles que l'ingénierie, la gestion des sciences sociales, et de plus en plus. Without any further ado, I would like to wish you the most motivating conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Charbonneau. I'll just take a moment here to reflect on the fact that we are living in very interesting times. There's an election happening south of the border today, which may have some effect on health science research in that country and many other things, not only in that country, but around the world. And I'd just like to take a moment to give thanks that we live north of the 49th parallel. where things are slightly different, I hope. Let me now welcome Abby Angel to the podium to give some remarks on behalf of the Canadian Institute for Health Research.
Merci, Paul. Vice President Charbonneau, Dean Jasmine, Dr. Naylor, Dr. Friesen, and colleagues. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici à l'Université d'Ottawa et participer dans le forum public Prix Friesen 2018. It is a great pleasure to be here at the University of Ottawa and once again participate at this public forum lecture as part of the 2018 Friesen Prize program. The prize and related events is organized by Friends of CIHR, which is a national organization focused on the support of science and society. We advocate on behalf of young people as career scientists and encourage the funding of health research in Canada. We are supportive of the goals and ideals of CIHR. And in that regard, I'd like to acknowledge our new president, Dr. Michael Strong, who is now with CIHR, and we wish him well. We are eager to recruit young people to our activities across the country. This year, we're honoring Dr. David Naylor, the 13th Henry Friesen International Prize winner, who was selected for his exceptional contributions to evaluative sciences and for his impact on health research policy development and funding. He will be formally introduced by Dr. Janet Rossant, president of the Gairdner Foundation, who was the 11th Henry G. Friesen International Prize winner and held fourth in this auditorium 2 years ago. Now, Friends of CIHR has had a productive year, and through a number of activities of the Friesen laureates, our mission has been furthered significantly. In the next slide, which will not appear, I list some of these projects. Beginning in 2017, Alan Bernstein, last year's Friesen Prize winner, undertook a series of institutional visits and was hosted by numbers of faculties of medicine across the country, where he engaged senior leaders, students, and policy people. Now, the impact of Friends of CIHR is furthered by partnering with a variety of like-minded societies, particularly the Canadian Society for Clinical Investigation, with whom we have collaborated actively for a number of years. Last year, Alex McKenzie gave a talk there as senior scientist of CHIO. Earlier this year, Friends of CIHR, in collaboration with Massey College at the University of Toronto, established the Janet Rossant Lectureship to honor Dr. Rossant. Her major contributions were in developmental biology and for her commitment to the development of young scientists during her role as chief scientist at the Hospital for Sick Children. Now, about 4 years ago, we expanded the scope of the Friesen Prize program to include science policy roundtables to draw attention to the important issues of the day and more specifically address the challenges facing young trainees and early career scientists. And over the past 4 years, we have published proceedings of science policy roundtables, as should have been shown on the next slide. We are particularly grateful to Dr. David Naylor for accepting the obligations inherited in the Friesen Prize program in addition to today's public forum lecture. Dr. Naylor will undertake a national tour over the next months and visit major institutions across Canada. Like past Friesen laureates, he will meet with academic leaders, senior scientists, and most importantly, young scientists in the training and early career researchers, his favorite audience. Dr. Naylor's wise counsel and deep knowledge of research funding are widely sought, and we are privileged to have him here in Ottawa on this occasion. Thank you, Dr. Naylor, for accepting the 2018 Friesen Prize, and we are looking forward to hearing your thoughts about emergence of health research as a data science. Now, I'd like to acknowledge colleagues and supporters. First, the nominators, who undertake the most important task of identifying qualified candidates for the prize. Secondly, the Friesen Prize Advisory Committee. They adjudicate and process the selection and recommendation of the prize winner. I'd also like to note that we have 9 members of our board in attendance today, which is an all-time high. Paul Armstrong, Bruce McManus, Rod McGuinness, Alex McKenzie, Linda Rabinek, Lynn Postovitz, and Reinhard Reitmeyer. Thank you, colleagues, for all you've done to develop and expand the Friesen Prize program and endorse the University of Ottawa in our partnership. Then, of course, the sponsors. And if you look at the back of your programs, I think they've been delivered, you'll see all the wonderful associations we've developed over the years, and we'd like to thank our sponsors, without whom and without their financial assistance, this program would not be possible. And finally, I'd like to thank Christine Castelvi, who has been the administrator of the program for a number of years. Thank you, Christina. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Abhi. I won't take credit for it, but I will say that the CBC radio is not particularly in love with PowerPoint, and we try to subvert that whenever possible. In fact, I will point out that CBC radio, in fact, Ideas, in fact, me, has been involved in this prize for a number of years, for 12 years, and the result has been that 12 people have been broadcast nationally on my program and heard by a larger audience than is in this auditorium today. So unfortunately, I haven't brought with me the date of the broadcast, but it will be broadcast sometime in December, I believe, and it will be heard as all the others have in the past. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Janet Rosslant, a former Friesen Prize winner, to introduce today's lecturer.
Thank you, Paul. It's a great pleasure to be back here. I was here 2 weeks ago with the Gardner lectures. So back here to introduce David Naylor, our guest of honor today and this year's Friesen awardee. I know David very well because currently he's actually my boss, because he's actually the interim CEO of the Hospital for Sick Children at the University of Toronto. And I think everybody at Sick Kids is amazed and delighted that he was willing to take on what he's probably finding out is a bigger job than he possibly imagined. But really, it's a fantastic opportunity for us at Sick Kids to have an amazing leader like David give us an inspiration for the future. But of course, that's not what he's celebrated for the Friesen Award. It really is his long career as a researcher, as a leader of institutions and universities, and as a public policy leader. So a little bit of background. He grew up in Ontario. He got his MD at the University of Toronto. He went as a Rhodes Scholar to Oxford, got a DPhil in Social and Administrative Studies, and then finished off his medical degrees in internal medicine, did a post-fellowship research in ClinEpi, joined the Department of Medicine at U of T in 1988. And essentially, he's been in Toronto in various guises ever since. 91 to 98, he initiated and really drove forward the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, which is really an amazing source of data that can be used to explore how the health system works or doesn't work. He's the author of many scholarly publications, but essentially he's moved on at a level of influence that very few of us can have. He went on from being the head of ISIS to be the Dean of Medicine at the University of Toronto, and then went on to be the president of the University of Toronto until very recently, when in 2013. And since then, and even during that time, he's of course very well known nationally for his leadership of several major policy studies that have had influence on where we sit today. He chaired the National Review of Public Health after the 2003 SARS outbreak, and that really catalyzed the creation of the Public Health Agency in Canada. He chaired in 2014 to 15, he chaired the Federal Advisory Panel on Healthcare Innovation, which maybe had perhaps not quite so much amazing influence, but who knows, maybe it still will. And the one that everybody in this room is probably most familiar with is the most recent report, which is called the Naylor Report in inverted commas, but it's actually not the Naylor Report. but it's the report on fundamental research, the Federal Review, support for fundamental science. And that report has really, of course, gained a huge influence and been appreciated by the research community, been taken up and advocated by the research community, but perhaps more importantly, it also has had influence on government and on research funding in Canada. So I think all of us as researchers can look back over David's many career innovations and say that he has had an influence that goes way beyond sitting at the University of Toronto, maybe even beyond the Hospital for Sick Children, to really be a national influence. And we look forward to seeing how science, under the kind of guidance that David has provided over the years, will move in the years ahead. So please join me in welcoming David Naylor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Friesen, for that very generous introduction and for your continued leadership in health research. To everyone else, please ignore Janet's overkind comments and lower your expectations immediately. My thanks are also due to Dr. Abby Angel and the board of the Friends of CIHR, and we do need to get these slides back to where they should be. Thank you. You know, it's a great honor to be following so many distinguished Friesen Prize winners, and we also have this mic on. Thank you. It is a remarkable cohort of individuals, and I feel greatly honored to be part of it. It's also an honor to address such a distinguished audience, and particularly to do so in the name of Dr. Henry Friesen. Henry, it's been 2 decades, I think, since I had the privilege of joining the large caravan that was following you as you led us on an epic journey, the transformation of the Medical Research Council of Canada into the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. I did some work with MRC along the way, and I watched closely as Henry Friesen worked his magic with the research community and with decision makers here in Ottawa. His vision was superb, his timing was impeccable, and with a sympathetic Prime Minister and Cabinet and our friend Alan Rock as Minister of Health, the government was receptive, and the rest is history. Let me emphasize that to this day, Dr. Friesen is still the only person who has won Gairdner Awards in 2 different categories. He is truly one of a kind, and please join me in thanking and acknowledging the real honoree, Dr. Henry Friesen. Now, I am starting in the red. We are 25 minutes behind. And so this will be an even faster ride than I had planned. But let me take a few minutes to outline what I won't and will be doing in the lecture. There's some health research policy here, but not much health care policy, although that's very relevant to the topic at hand. And this isn't about population health and broad health determinants, another area of interest for many in the room, including myself. But that's something of a separate story than the one today. And the focus for the first 55% of the talk is on clinical and health services research, particularly the growth of quantitative methods as tools to understand healthcare and improve treatment, and some of the people who shape that. Throughout those remarks, the connecting thread will be the evergreen issue that is at the heart of every encounter between a health professional and someone seeking help. And that is how we can match a therapeutic intervention or strategy to the specific needs of a patient at hand. In the next 45% of the talk, I want to look ahead a bit to a better world, drawing not on the recent report, but the one before it on health innovation, thinking about a world where we have more precise diagnostic and treatment tools and more opportunities to provide higher quality patient care. And in my view, that better future will depend heavily on more intensive mining of patient-specific data of all types, not least genomic and other biomarkers. And I will be arguing that other nations are moving much faster to shape and embrace that future, and that Canada urgently needs to catch up. In the last 1% of the talk, I will offer just 2 closing thoughts. Now, some disclaimers may be in order. This entire talk is a fast flight over a lot of terrain. I'm picking up just a few landmarks and a very small number of people from high altitude. I can't come close to naming all those who deserve to be acknowledged, even though many Canadians have been part of this story. And it's certainly a privilege to be here at the University of Ottawa with the Dean of Medicine and the Vice President and so many others who've made a difference to Canadian health research. So I apologize in advance for many generalizations and some errors of acknowledgement. I also have to apologize to Paul Kennedy for the fact there's a lot of PowerPoint in this talk. And some of the messages will be difficult to convey without slides. Paul, if you can figure out how to put the slides out over radio, we may do very well together. The research in which I took part merits only passing mention, but I will borrow occasionally and shamelessly from some work of a more synthetic nature where I was sole or lead author. So let's get started. The great Lewis Thomas called clinical medicine the youngest science, and in many ways it is. Systematic observation has been used by healthcare practitioners with inquiring minds for centuries, but the use of assembling formal quantitative methods has been a rarity. As a simple illustration, what may well be the most influential textbook ever printed on medicine was written by a Canadian, Sir William Osler. And an aside here, Sir William is the first of what will be a procession of old white guys on these slides, a point to which I will return at the very end of these remarks. The first edition of Osler's textbook was published in 1892. It was a bracing review of how little was known about most diseases and how to treat them. That accounted for its influence, given the credulity of the times. But his skepticism was largely based on qualitative methods. So happens that Osler's peak period of professional activity, the years bridging the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was also a time in which applied statistics was flourishing. Two British polymaths, Francis Galton and his protege Carl Pearson, made huge contributions. Both were animated by the emerging field of genetics, and both dabbled, alas, in eugenics. But the statistical toolkit they created was very well suited to clinical research. As it happens, that toolkit found limited uptake in clinical research between the two world wars, but in contrast, in the realm of public health and population-based epidemiology, there was no shortage of advances and practical applications. Mapping of life expectancy into life tables, population-level statistics on incidence and prevalence of diseases, outbreak tracing and statistical analyses of risk factors for the so-called diseases of civilization. All this and more root in those years. Now, soon enough, a few souls decided that the epidemiology of healthcare itself was almost as interesting as the epidemiology of disease. And in this regard, an English pediatrician named J. Alison Glover, very British name, decided to trace outbreaks, so to speak, colectomy among school children. His now classic paper was published in 1938 and showed startling variation rates by age, sex, county of residence, and the hospital to which referral was made. Some of those variations, along with the somewhat mordant closing comment of his paper, are shown on the screen. Glover's work signaled the beginning of an important trend. Many studies in the 1940s, not least in the prepaid health plans in the US, began using the observational methods of public health research and epidemiology to critically examine what doctors were doing. With improved computing power in the post-war period came the assembly of ever larger data sets related to the administration of health services and also to the payment of healthcare bills, whether through public plans or through private insurance. The potential of these sources caught the attention of a young nephrologist with public health training named John E. Wennberg. In a landmark publication in Science in 1973, Wennberg and Gittleson examined geographic variations in the delivery of medical care in the state of Vermont. And for the next 35 years, Jack Wennberg mapped variations within and across the states of America, and sometimes in comparison to other nations. Rates of surgical procedures and medical admissions, expenditures per capita, hospital costs, lengths of stay, relevant markers of disease incidence that might somehow alter the use of resources or procedures, supply of physicians, insurance status, you name it. Wennberg and his colleagues examined it and found puzzling variability. Incidentally, tonsillectomy rates in northern New England still wobbled mysteriously by region, much as they had 70 years earlier in Glover's analysis of southern Old England. By 1996, Wennberg's team was able to publish a full atlas of healthcare in the US. It's a series that continues to this day. Sometime later, Richard Smith, editor emeritus of the British Medical Journal, wrote about that first atlas as follows. It is not wholly fanciful to compare the Dartmouth Atlas of Healthcare with On the Origin of Species. Both books resulted from a rigorous accumulation of data and fundamentally changed our worldview. Darwin's book showed our descent from apes. The Atlas exploded the belief that medicine is based firmly on science. Alas, no one said such expansive and glorious things about a similar atlas published in Canada, even though it too was part of a series and was actually published 2 years before Jack Wennberg's atlas. We did, however, get a few exciting headlines in the local press, a very Canadian response. The question everyone kept asking was, why? Why does healthcare vary so much? Wennberg focused on the demand side. He argued that the prevailing ethos was that more is always better, and the best way to deal with supplier-induced demand was to educate consumers to make better decisions. Others argued that we didn't actually know that. We didn't know which rate was right. Was there underservicing? Was there overservicing? Some combination thereof? Were the right decisions being made on the basis of evidence? Robert Brooke from the RAND Corporation in UCLA accordingly took a very different tack from Wennberg. Brooke used psychometric methods and case audits. He asked expert panels of doctors to digest the available evidence and rate the appropriateness of specific interventions for large numbers of case scenarios with different permutations and combinations of clinical features that one might see in practice, a way of getting beyond the constrained inclusion criteria of many clinical trials. Those scenarios could then be mapped onto the relevant medical records, matching the permutations and combinations. This and other work by Brooke and his team, stretching over some 4 decades, has made a huge difference to the way we think about quality of care and manage it within healthcare systems, particularly since automation has allowed pre-review rather than post-hoc assessments of decision-making. Those findings, however, didn't solve the puzzle of variations in care. Higher or lower utilization rates simply weren't well correlated in either direction with better or worse decision-making as judged by these expert panels. And there were 2 other findings that emerged from Brooke's team and its line of research. The first, intriguingly, was that clinical culture varies a lot. Interventional cardiologists believe in intervention more than family doctors or non-invasive cardiologists. Surgeons believe in surgery more than non-surgeons. British doctors were more conservative than US doctors. And when our group got involved in some of these studies, we found, predictably, that Canadians came right up the middle very consistently. The second finding was that the panels either didn't know how to rate a given scenario, or they disagreed vehemently on how to interpret the evidence and what ratings should be made. That type of patient ended up in something of a gray zone. The evidence simply wasn't definitive enough in either direction, and as the slide shows, these weren't just theoretical issues. Actual audits of practice showed that a substantial amount of intervention was taking place in these gray zones of uncertainty, as shown on the far right column. So asked in 1999 by the New England Journal of Medicine to opine on a definition of appropriate care, I had to admit that this was a very elastic concept. I also found myself thinking back at that juncture to an essay, again, one by Lewis Thomas, published more than 2 decades earlier. Thomas wrote about halfway technologies, treatments that really weren't definitive because we simply didn't have a firm enough base in biological science to design the interventions that would make a big difference. I have to say that weighing those 2 ideas, those 2 inputs, helped me decide it was time for a change in my direction personally. I thought about retooling as a genetic epidemiologist to help make some sense of human disease upstream. I also thought about retreating to administration. I retreated, and I have no regrets. But I've never lost that uneasy sense that clinical epidemiology is often clinical epiphenomenology, and that the ideal of evidence-based medicine will always be limited in impact so long as the evidence is fundamentally constrained by our collective ignorance about the underlying causes and mechanisms of human disease. Now you may say in response, what about clinical trials? Let's first acknowledge that health practitioners have always done less than rigorous trials of therapy with individual patients. If you take a glance at the wonderful online James Lind library, you'll find many accounts of pioneers conducting what today could be described as crossover studies or comparative trials of some description. But really, it's arguable that it was not until the Second World War that randomized trials were conducted in a manner that seems reasonably familiar to modern readers. 4 trials in particular helped lay the foundations for modern randomized blinded studies. One involved a mycotoxin to treat the common cold, unsurprisingly, negative results. 3 others involved streptomycin and other drugs to treat varied manifestations of tuberculosis. All were designed primarily by Austin Bradford Hill, professor of medical statistics at the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. Bradford Hill wrote about these methods eloquently, but they spread rather slowly. The swinging 60s saw a growing criticism of these unfounded medical practices, and by 1971, the time was ripe for a definitive iconoclastic blast. The iconoclast who delivered it was somewhat unexpected, a Scottish pulmonologist and public health specialist named Archie Cochrane. His rock-carling lectures skewered the prevalence of poorly validated practices, called for widespread use of rigorous randomized trials to test treatments, and also advocated for systematic reviews of randomized trials to see what the totality of research evidence told us about various treatments. Cochrane's small volume, probably unknown to many in the room, actually had a huge influence in the Anglosphere. It galvanized the development of the discipline of clinical epidemiology and laid the cornerstone for what became known as evidence-based medicine. Cochrane today is memorialized through the Cochrane Collaboration, now in its 25th year of existence. Cochrane Centers exist around the world, covering a huge range of specialties, and they are all dedicated to the continuous quantitative synthesis of relevant randomized trial data. Along with improving randomized trials, a variety of new applications of quantitative methods to clinical care were further developed and championed brilliantly by David Sackett and his colleagues at McMaster during the 1970s and 1980s. Alvin Feinstein at Yale was another enormously prolific and influential champion of the application of epidemiology and psychometric concepts to deepen our understanding of health and illness. During this Camelot period, a consensus emerged broadly that most clinical trials were too small for reasonable conclusions to be drawn from them. And so in the 1980s and 1990s, more and more trials were undertaken at massive scale. That was particularly important when mortality was the endpoint at stake, so small differences would matter. And specialties like cardiology and oncology were particularly well organized and formed massive consortia to test new treatments with big randomized trials. The International Studies of Infarct Survival was one such consortium, spearheaded by the renowned Oxford epidemiologist and Gardner laureate Richard Peto, in some ways the intellectual grandson of Bradford Hill. Their second big study of treatment for acute myocardial infarction is widely recognized as a truly historic endeavor. It used an elegant factorial design, testing chewed aspirin, intravenously infused streptokinase, both or neither. The protocol was deliberately simple, with the result that 417 coronary care units from 16 countries signed up, and 17,187 patients were successfully randomized over the course of 3 years. Each drug worked dramatically to lower mortality, and they worked better together, as the figure clearly shows. However, the question I posed at the outset of this lecture, that question of applicability to individuals, did turn up in the minds of the editors of The Lancet. Trials do give us a sense of what, on average, works for a population of patients. In examining the draft of the trial manuscript, the editors asked whether more subgroup analyses could be undertaken to determine whether some types of patients benefited more than others. The cheeky response of the ISIS-2 investigators has become legendary. They did an analysis by astrological signs to prove the pointlessness and dangers of this type of post-hoc data dredging, and in The Lancet published totally implausible variation in the effect sizes for the two interventions based on being a Gemini or a Libra. Now, this was cheeky and very telling. And there's no question that univariate subgroup splicing and slicing and dicing is an invitation to both type 1 and type 2 errors. Underpinning it is what Parker and I have called the assumption of multiplicative effects. And that is, relative benefits are assumed to be constant across subgroups, so absolute benefits are greater for high-risk patients just by simple mathematics. Now, it's a pretty good rule of thumb, but it is also at times quite misleading. Think of it this way. Epidemiologists have rightly warned against inferences based solely on biology when it comes to treatments. That's one of the axioms of evidence-based medicine. But then they make inferences based solely on questionable statistical assumptions, and surprise, sometimes biology bites back. Sometimes it matters a lot. There are actually quite a few examples in the literature, but I'll pick only a telling and recent one. Dalcetrabib is a cholesterol ester transfer protein inhibitor. It dramatically raises HDL cholesterol levels, and it should, in theory, improve cardiovascular outcomes among people who've had an acute coronary event. However, in 2012, a well-conducted trial involving no less than 15,871 patients reported no benefit from the drug. A group of Canadian investigators later found that a single nucleotide polymorphism affecting a gene on chromosome 16 was a massive modifier of the drug's effects, as shown on the slide. The reason the drug appeared useless was because those with genotype AA had a 39% reduction in the endpoint compared to placebo, while those with genotype GG had a 27% increase in events, and heterozygotes fell in the middle. And one has to wonder, how often has this type of response heterogeneity been the reason why a particular drug failed in a randomized trial? And again, logical extension, how much better would treatment be if we could match drug selections more accurately, not just according to genetic markers, but perhaps taking into better account a range of determinants of treatment responsiveness? We want to be clear about something here, and that is that evidence-based decision-making based on randomized trials was and remains a massive improvement over guesswork based on the last case, the best case, the worst case, and other forms of clinical anecdotage. In general, it is perilous to draw inferences from pathophysiology or from observational epidemiology without some convergent validation involving rigorous clinical experiments. But the evergreen challenge of generalizing trial-derived averages to individuals has persisted. McMaster's Gordon Guyatt is a visionary and superb scientist, a Canadian national treasure in my view, as well as a dedicated clinician. Gordon Guyatt addressed this challenge as early as 1986, when he and his co-authors published a method for N-of-1 studies in the New England Journal of Medicine. The laudable goal was to embrace and to improve the time-honored tactic of clinicians who do trials of therapy in individual patients. Again, in 1992, lead authoring what is now a world-famous paper promulgating the concept of evidence-based medicine, Dr. Guyot's clinical roots actually showed clearly. After some initial triumphalist claims shown on the slide, there was this disclaimer. I think the wording could have been more generous about the foundational importance of basic and translational science, but it candidly acknowledged the elephant in the room. The fact that for a given patient, we are often making educated guesses about whether they will reap the upsides or the downsides of a given prescribed treatment. That was 1992, and since then the world has changed quite a lot. The unveiling of the results of the Human Genome Project in 2000 is obviously a relevant milestone in that regard. On one hand, it was a landmark collaboration that heralded a new era. On the other, it could be said that the HGP exemplified how research was being transformed by the convergence of major advances in molecular biology, with those also occurring in computer science and mathematics. In particular, staggering improvements in computing power and storage capacity were enabling a new era of bioinformatics, with data mining and wide uptake of various forms of machine learning becoming routine in basic and translational medical science. Now, many of us will remember this day. There's no question that early on the hype around genomics far outstripped what might reasonably be expected even from whole genome sequencing. I think most observers recognized early on that the field was bedeviled by what one might call the population genomics paradox. Human pathobiology turns out to be very seriously complicated, and so is the world of gene expression and the role of genes and their products in disease. But as it turned out, the limits of genetic determinism seemed to focus the attention of a growing number of scientists worldwide on all the other factors that might interact with one or more genes or their products to cause disease. And that shift was made much easier by the massive growth in the volume of digitized information concerning patients and their journeys through the world's healthcare systems. Furthermore, wearables, smartphones, and remote sensors all enabled more continuous data collection, a vast improvement on simply accessing information from intermittent encounters between patients and their healthcare providers. Momentum built, and less than a quarter of a century after EBM was announced as a new paradigm, we seem to have another paradigm, and that was first called molecular or personalized medicine. It was then retitled to acknowledge the role of diverse sources of information and termed precision medicine. Precision medicine signaled a new level of convergence not just of data science and health sciences, but increasingly a commingling of basic, translational, clinical, and epidemiological research. The ideal was clear: better targeted treatments for subgroups of patients, and sometimes, down to the individual level, might be achievable if we deepened and broadened the data being collected from various patient populations. I have to say that in many ways it was a perfect complement, conceptually, to the epistemological developments and quantitative trends that I was describing earlier. But at the time, I was simply an interested spectator and consumer of the literature and primarily an administrator. In mid-2014, that changed a bit when Ron Ambrose and Canada's Minister of Health formed an advisory panel on healthcare innovation. I had the privilege of chairing the group, whose remarkable members are shown on the screen, and we were supported by a very dedicated and talented secretariat. We toured the country, canvassed the opinions of providers and the public, did considerable research on developments abroad, and gained some sense of how and why Canada's healthcare system seemed to be falling behind. Then we had to get a report written identifying thematic areas where federal intervention might accelerate innovation in Canadian healthcare, and making recommendations about specific actions that the Government of Canada might take in partnership with the provinces. One of the innovation themes that surfaced, perhaps predictably, was precision medicine. It was clear that in 2013, the Government of the United Kingdom had made a big bet on the potential of precision medicine with the creation of Genome England, not as a granting agency, but as a focused demonstration and research project. And we found that many countries were contemplating similar moves. As well, our friends at CIHR convened a workshop with leading experts from across Canada to give us a sense of the possibilities and of Canada's level of funding and preparedness. That session was enormously exciting. It was also disturbing because it emerged that Canada really had no plan that would equip us to deal with this fast-moving scientific frontier. And today, I would argue that we still have no serious plan, even though there continue to be concerted developments at a national level all over the world. And so let me do two things next. First, on the screen, I'll display an abbreviated version of some of the recommendations we made to the Government of Canada in 2015. And I'll also tell you a little bit about what we wrote. And here's an edited and quoted version. Evidence-based medicine remains an important toolkit of ideas for managing a clinical realm where decisions reflect a struggle to do the right thing in the face of the play of chance. For example, because many drugs have only a small chance of benefiting a given patient, randomized trials must be very large to reliably assess drug effectiveness or combined through meta-analysis. Precision medicine, in contrast, has the ambition of allowing clinicians to pursue a more deterministic approach. Originating from root biological causes and pathways, new biomarkers can radically enhance the signal-to-noise ratio in laboratory tests or tumor characterization. And by targeting the right patient with the right drug at the right time, precision medicine may well reduce the collateral injuries and waste associated with the shotgun pharmacotherapy that currently prevails. All that said, the need for a disciplined and critical approach to clinical research evidence is not likely to disappear anytime soon. The applicability of precision medicine to many common conditions remains unclear. Thus, the question contemplated by the panel was not how to suddenly change clinical paradigms, but how to ensure that patients in Canada's healthcare systems will be able to benefit from these fast-breaking changes in the near future and medium term as they become ever more pervasive. No actions were taken in response to those recommendations, but I must tell you that other nations are acting decisively. For example, at the time we wrote our report, funding for a big US project had only recently been announced. Now the United States is rolling out what is evocatively entitled All of Us, a plan to do whole exome sequencing and aggregate longitudinal data from various sources, including electronic health records, for 1 million American volunteers, a giant cohort study. Speaking of the US, amidst all the chaos, unfairness, and waste, and the post-truthiness of that great nation, what may be the best small healthcare system in the world is actually in operation there, called Geisinger. It is based in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and it is now offering genotyping to all of its enrollees and has already accumulated profiles with related medical information and follow-up on over 200,000 members. Similar efforts are afoot in places as far afield as Australia, Qatar, and Singapore. The world leader, however, remains the United Kingdom. A big part of their success has been the vision, solidarity, and coherent leadership exerted by the medical and biological research communities. This outstanding commentary in The Lancet from 3 years ago speaks volumes, and it does seem that Britain's medical and research leaders continue to be heard. For example, you can see here the latest developments in the UK from the website of Genome England. Building on the success of Genome England and the UK Biobank, just last month, the government approved funding to build a huge cohort with whole genome sequencing of 1 million citizens and genotyping of another 4 million. 5 million people will comprise this cohort. Let me repeat. Notwithstanding all the focus on genetic data in these exercises, these genotyping and sequencing initiatives are in some measure simply table stakes, a loss leader. Over time, precision medicine has increasingly come to be conceptualized as encompassing a very broad set of indicators, including clinical and behavioral information. Data is relevant from pathological samples and from laboratory tests, input from wearables and remote monitors, as well as physiological tracings, digital images, and even local environmental data. In all these instances, what is envisaged is actually going back to some old-fashioned epidemiology and doing cohort studies with lots of information. Analyzing these heterogeneous data sets will require enormous skill. And shown here from JAMA a few weeks ago is a map of sorts with the various types of machine learning solutions now in play, together with some of their milestones of performance, such as beating humans in a whole variety of tasks. This, too, is a relatively recent and revolutionary set of developments. Logistic regression, that workhorse tool for modeling that we all know and love, was only really refined for wide use by David Cox in 1958. Most of these tools, including artificial neural networks, do have their roots in mathematical concepts and statistics extending back many decades, but it's really only in the last 15 years that data science has become fit for purpose in this global scientific endeavor. Perhaps naively, I do remain optimistic about Canada's prospects. But we have fallen behind in terms of building the info and infrastructure for precision medicine, or in developing a coherent national strategy and the appropriate cohorts. Our firepower in data science is an enormous offsetting advantage. For example, shown on this slide are the 3 Canadian godfathers of the field of artificial intelligence, all internationally renowned. And coming up right behind them is a veritable army of talented young data researchers. As well, our young and established talent in basic bioscience and the clinical evaluative sciences is world-class. This is vitally important because we will need brilliant cohort study design and data acquisition to make sense of all the information that could be gathered to help inform our understanding of health and illness. More importantly, most of the results generated from these huge data gathering exercises must be seen as hypotheses, requiring testing and elucidation variously by rigorous laboratory experimentation or in imaginative clinical trials. We're also fortunate, I would argue, in the diversity of the populations in our larger cities. They are truly mirrors of the world and hotbeds of genetic, metabolic, nutritional, and behavioral diversity. And the findings from any Canadian precision medicine initiative may well have great relevance to our Indigenous peoples as their communities continue to struggle with an excess burden from a variety of chronic diseases. While there is no official plan, in one respect, the Government of Canada has actually opened the door somewhat for the research community. There's some relevant wording from Budget 2018. This focus on digital infrastructure is not a substitute for a national strategy. It does not provide the operational funding we need for cohort studies. It does not incent provinces to begin to use the techniques of genome testing more widely, but it does help at least a little bit to get things rolling, and it is a meaningful sum. Taken all together, I believe that with the requisite political will, with interjurisdictional collaboration, some operating funding, and serious leadership from the health research community, there remains no reason why Canada cannot leapfrog many nations that have a head start in this domain. Think of it as another Canadian gift to humankind. We gave the world evidence-based medicine, and now with some imagination and ambition, perhaps we can give the world evidence-based precision medicine. Time is marching on. I want to draw these remarks to a close with just 2 thoughts, as promised. The first relates to the next generation of health researchers. They are digital natives in many cases, and I'm amazed, on the one hand, at how many young bioscientists are fully comfortable in deploying the diverse forms of machine learning in their research, and conversely, very impressed that clinician researchers and clinician scientists are extraordinarily fluent in the realm of genomics. These new researchers are radically more diverse in gender and ethnocultural backgrounds than my generation or the one that preceded it. No more slide decks full of pictures of old white guys. And this up-and-coming generation also crosses disciplinary boundaries without fear, and has a healthy disrespect for conventional wisdom. If they are supported properly, there's no limit to what they can do, and I would therefore like to repeat the call made in the 2017 Fundamental Science Report for better funding of Canada's graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and early career researchers. An important down payment was made last year, and more consideration was promised in that same budget. I sincerely hope that that consideration bears fruit in Budget 2019 with generous support for the young research talent in this country. My second and final thought relates to Dr. Henry Friesen. When Henry Friesen conceived the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, He argued for an expansive and integrative view of what health research would be. He also argued for a closer linkage of health research with the healthcare system. And much of that is exactly what is afoot in other countries with major efforts in the realm of precision medicine. And so, Henry, after all these years, it seems your vision remains as relevant as ever. Again, thank you for your leadership. Thanks also to the nominators, the adjudicators, and the Friends of CIHR for inviting me to present this lecture, and to our colleagues at the University of Ottawa for their hospitality. And thank you above all to everyone in attendance for your kind attention. On time. On time. Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Naylor provided the perfect segue, I think. Please welcome Henry Friesen to give some comments.
Yeah, first of all, Paul, thank you very much for your continued interest in ideas in publicizing these magnificent lectures by extraordinary people who contributed so much to making Canada a better place. Thank you. Secondly, I'd like to that we are at the University of Ottawa, whose former president was my minister who enabled and facilitated the creation of CIHR. I can assure you, CIHR would not have existed without his deep and abiding interest in seeing it develop. I'm also grateful that Mona Nemer, who was on the council at the time, now has a major role in advising governments on science policy, and we wish her well in her important task. We saw firsthand the powerful intellect of David Naylor as he provided us with his inspiring words and insightful analysis of the future that is available if we but have the will to pursue what we know is the right thing to do. Thank you for your leadership in many occasions with the magnificent report that really has fueled and inspired, and why I believe many people in this audience are here to express to you their gratitude for the wise counsel that report conveyed, and that the government chose to begin to implement the conclusions and the recommendations that you made. I think you provide us with a glimpse of the tantalizing prospect that is at hand as science unfolds and the full power of the tools that are available at an accelerated pace to apply to improve the health of not only Canadians, but people around the world. You have inspired us with your words and with your recommendations. Finally, to Dr. Abby Angel, thank you. To you and your committee for the leadership you have provided for Friends of CIHR in creating these wonderful lectures, which regularly now for the 13th year has given me an opportunity to come back and see so many people and friends who've enriched my life. I truly am a part of all that I have met. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Friesen. I'm the host of a program called Ideas. I'm going to give you food for thought. There's a late lunch to be served after this, and I hope all can take part in it and share some of these ideas. Thanks for being here.